Hey guys, it's Dr. Chloe and you're listening to the Radical Remedy podcast. Today's episode is with the absolutely incredible Mel Hopper Koppelman. Now, Mel is such a badass and I have followed her work for years. She is not only an integrative healthcare practitioner, but she's an educator, writer, blogger, researcher, and truly one of the greatest nerds I have met. I am blown away by how deep Mel goes into every facet of science that she is really interested in. So she has not only done a tremendous amount of studying developmental neurology, but she dives into ancient classical Chinese medicine, as well as deep diving into functional medicine. And I could listen to her explain these things all day, every day. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode as much as I do. We go down so many different nooks and crannies. Let me know what you think, and please like, subscribe, and follow the show. It's really important to help us grow, and I really, really, really appreciate it. Dr. Bell, you have done such incredible work diving deep into neuroscience, into Chinese medicine, into Chinese medical philosophy, and it's such an honor to have you here, and I can't wait to see where this conversation goes.
I'm excited. It sounds like we've been walking on parallel paths, so it's nice to find a kindred spirit and to get together and have a chat.
Yes. No, this is going to be really fun. So I know that you have been diving deep into so many different facets of health, including doing a lot of work in terms of, sort of functional medicine, doing a lot of lab testing and going deep into that scientific, super nerdy world. And one of the things that I find as a doctor of Chinese medicine, and I think you found this also, is that a lot of times these labs have sort of misleading results and they're not really getting the full picture. And to me, a lot of times it just comes back to Chinese medicine really deeply understanding the ecology of the body in a way that these labs and sort of functional medicine or Western medicine do not understand. And I think you refer to it as sort of first principles. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that because I really just love your perspective on it all.
Sure. So when I talk about first principles thinking is really just understanding the essence of how something works. In this case, we're talking about health, but we could apply it more broadly to nature, to living systems. You can really apply this lens to anything, but it's just the basic rules of how something works. And they tend to be fairly simple, and they tend to explain really well what you're looking at. And so what happens is that when you look at biochemistry, which is a view of the body that's very zoomed in, it's based on a whole lot of assumptions that most people are not aware of. They just innocently run their lab tests and look at the numbers and go, oh, is this good or bad? And they don't realize what they've walked into. And so I'm happy to unpack all of that. But at the end of the day, the biochemistry does not reveal the first principles. So let's say you wanted to figure out how a human worked. You could run lab tests for a million years and you would never get to the first principles because it's not the right lens for doing so. That would be like going to the ocean and looking at all the sand and trying to figure out how the kind of oceanic ecosystem works. It's not going to happen, right? So what I realized is that you actually need to understand the first principles first so that you understand what questions to ask and how to interpret what's in front of you. And so very few people do that because most people are under the illusion that you can find out how things work by looking at microscopic. And then folks who have tended to be more attracted to, let's say, the philosophy of nature, which is what science was originally, maybe are not as interested in quantitative data analysis, so there haven't been very many people, but there have been some who've basically gone deep enough to go, uh-oh, the way I was like, uh-oh, we've gone too far, come back in this direction. But basically for me, that was based on a series of many, many, many aha moments or, flip-flopping of recommendations of how to use data, or I'm running a lab test and then the lab company adds another marker and it's this is the most important marker. And I'm like, well, what were we doing before then? If this is the most important marker now and it all is about acromantia or whatever, then What were we doing?
Acromancy is so hot right now.
Oh, well, that's a whole other story.
Has nothing to do with the funding behind the company doing the marketing at all.
I've got acromancy stories. I've got all kinds of stories, but you do it enough times and you have these realizations that this doesn't mean what they're saying that it means. And not because there's any sort of like malintent. It's because nobody is asking questions about what they're actually looking at. So I'll stop there. There's like lots of rambling and ranting that can go on.
Oh, no. I love the rambling and ranting. That's what you're here for. I think it's so fascinating to watch because it's been really interesting watching functional medicine come to the scene and become so popular and how that has evolved. So like I know some really brilliant people in functional medicine who have taught a bunch of coaches, and then the coaches charge hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and then they're running all these labs. And it's funny because I was talking to, a friend in the space, in sort of the wellness space, and I was like, oh, well, I think I'm going to start doing customizable formulas for people online. I really just miss it. Like, there's nothing I love more than writing a customizable formula. It's like, that's my poetry. It's my heart space. So like, and she just looked at me and was like, but how could you possibly do that without doing lab tests? And I was like, this person. And I talked to the person. I could look at their tongue. Like, I wish I could feel their pulses and like be there with them. But like, I can fully do an intake without labs. I would love to hear a little bit, like, where at this point, since you've sort of gone down the deep end with all the labs, where are you now in terms of doing some of the lab work, in terms of, diagnostically? How do you start looking at a patient? What are you using most frequently these days?
Good question. Good question. I know I have a bit of a love-hate with the labs. And so, yeah, just to give a little bit of my background, I originally trained in Chinese medicine and I got an MSc. And then I quickly started realizing that nutrition was important for my patients, and I knew just enough to be dangerous. And when I trained, I didn't train, my acupuncture training did not include herbs, which is actually more standard in the UK. So in the US, it's more common that you would do both at the same time. And I really wanted to have an internal medicine aspect to my practice. And based on my own experience going to a Chinese medical herbalist, I decided that my internal medicine would be functional medicine. She was lovely. She's well-trained. She's very intelligent. And the treatment she gave me was kind of a mismatch for what was going on with me. And so I left with the idea that Chinese medicine has a lot to offer, but maybe that it wasn't up to the task of treating the complex modern person, right? That was at that time. And so when it came to adding internal medicine to my practice, and because I'm nerdy and because I'm interested and I want to know how things work and I like the biochemistry and quantification, I studied functional medicine, so I got a second MSc in functional medicine and then did a lot of additional training. And the promise really was that if you ran the lab tests, you'd be able to see exactly what was wrong and what to do, and then you'd be able to fix people. That's still the idea.
Yeah.
It's based on that certainty, that basically if you collect enough data, then you will know the answer, and then you'll know what to do from folks. And I'm here, over a decade later to tell you that that doesn't happen. That doesn't work. Unfortunately, it would be nice.
Humans are slightly more complex than that, huh? Fascinating.
Yeah, it would turn out that may be the case. So here's where I've landed with it. So that spurred me to find better clinical models. That I felt like Chinese medicine had a lot to offer, but it was missing something. Functional medicine was like a very lovely decade-long distraction in some ways, but it didn't understand the essence of what it was looking at. So it's really about context and interpretation. And so that inspired me to really kind of tear apart my understanding and build it back up again from the beginning. And that was a couple of years ago, where I kind of had to like raise the white flag and go, I give up what I'm doing. And it was interesting because I had a lot of professional encouragement. Like a lot of people wanted me to teach them functional medicine, and I was helping patients. Like I would get good feedback from patients, but in my heart of hearts, I knew that this was not right. And so I had to basically say, I'm not a spring chicken, but I'm young enough to like really learn how to do this properly. And so I went back to the drawing board, and that's when I retrained in Chinese medicine with Dr. Ed Neal in Neijing medicine, which is completely life-changing. And I really recommend it to anyone. You do not need to be a clinician to do that training. It is beautiful. And I also learned a more like complex systems approach to Chinese medicine and herbal medicine from various people, but especially Jeremy Cornish over at the Damn Good Doctors Club.
Yes, I've heard great things about Jeremy.
Can't recommend him enough either, and his way of looking at things. So he, and then also the other leg of the stool was studying developmental neurology with Dr. Melillo, because basically I was fortunate enough to have the perfect confluence of health problems myself, where any one of these things is like a completely paradigm-shifting, mind-bending, awesome upgrade of understanding, but none of them on their own was sufficient to help me or my patients. So blending them together is where it's been at. So in terms of your question about where labs fit in, I no longer need labs in order to help people get better. The main role that labs play, there's a few. One is that many patients are coming into my world or my practice having had labs done, and they have a fair amount of stories around their markers and baggage. And it's going to, I think can be difficult. It depends on the timing and the person to help guide them towards something healthier and something more helpful if you can't demonstrate that you understand that. Like, I could say, forget about your cholesterol, let's do this. But if I don't demonstrate to them that I understand lipids really well, it's harder for them to feel safe. But if I'm like, I understand lipids very well, here's a bit about lipids, now come over, this place is better, That's one reason. It's not just like it's patient communication, but it's really bridging where the person is, meeting them where they are. They sense there's something better. They want that something better, but they want to make sure that it's safe, really, that you know what you're doing. So that's part of it. Another part of it is really just observing how things change over time. So I've just used the example of cholesterol and lipids. Who cares? Like, we can pick any. But all right, well, let's say that they're wonky. All right, we note that they're wonky. And then that doesn't really go, I'm not going to recommend interventions or inputs or practices based on wonky lipids, because that's just not how the system works. We're going to go through a clinical process. We're going to go in order. It's going to be based more on first principles, and then we can retest the lipids and just see what happens. There are always outliers, cases where maybe, or like extreme cases, emergency cases, genetic cases, extreme cases where you do treat the lipids. I mean, there does exist, using this example, there does exist an actual genetic disorder where people do overproduce cholesterol, and that's a really great time for statins, and that is life-changing. It's just that's like 0.000% of the time, right? So that's another time, is just to monitor changes, and that's how I use lab tests on myself, and that's how I use it with patients. And then the third area, which has been interesting to kind of come to, is that, and this is a little bit where the neurology comes in, is this increasing awareness of the different roles of the hemispheres, of the two brain hemispheres in health, in perception, in development, in cognition, in embodiment, and spirituality. It's very interesting. And when people are chronically ill, then they have to adapt in order to survive somehow. And the nervous system and the mind have different strategies for that. Some folks will tend to become super, super sensitive, biologically paranoid. They notice everything. So their body's amplifying signals. So just in case it's important, which makes it very hard to function. So that these people tend to be in a lot of pain. They tend to be derailed by electricity and very small amounts of mold and all these things. And so they have a hypersensitivity. There's another group of people, not super uncommon, who their strategy, it was really just to disable the check engine light. So they do not feel their body. So they may be very inflamed and they may be very sick, but they don't actually notice it. I was one of those people, and it has its advantages because my labs were telling me that there was a big problem. There were plenty of times when my labs were like worse than any of my patients. I'm like, oh my gosh. But I was getting up every day and doing my thing, not because I'm so awesome, but because I literally couldn't feel it. And I've had other patients in that category. And in one case, it was a patient who their first sign that they had any problems was a heart attack. Now, you're not going to tell me that they had a completely healthy heart one day and then they had a heart attack. They were having problems the whole time, but they were, they weren't receiving those signals. So I think labs and also wearable data are particularly important for that group of people because they're not feeling the subjective sense of feeling worse or better. And that can be retrained and improved as they get healthier. And they also need to feel that it's safe to do that, because like me, I have patients who they don't feel their bodies, but that also enables them to keep working, even though they're sick, right? And so it's like, well, would you want to feel your body if it meant that you felt too sick to go to work? The answer might be no, but that's why they're not feeling their improvements. So in that case, quantification is very helpful. So that's sort of how I'm using it these days.
No, that makes sense. And it's always, I'm sure you get this as a practitioner, it's always fascinating to meet those patients who are just completely unaware of their bodies whatsoever. And you'll be like, okay, so how often do you poop? And they're like, I had no idea. And you're like, do you legitimately, I'm sure I've said this on the podcast because it blows my mind. I'm like, do you legitimately have no idea or are you just uncomfortable talking about this, which is totally fair. But it's also interesting with, I work a lot with kids with special needs. My son, Remy, has a rare genetic disorder, as I was telling you earlier. So Remy is very hyposensitive. So most people are used to the paradigm of kids on the spectrum who are hypersensitive. So they're, much more sensitive to sounds and textures and foods and whatnot. Remy eats bubbles like all day. Like the kid eats kimchi. The louder you are, the more he thinks it's hysterical. Like he is just so hyposensitive. He doesn't get sick very often. So it all fits in very well with that. And I love that you have studied with Dr. Malello. Anybody who's listening, also, I have an episode with him. Remy and I did some work with him a couple of years ago, and he's just an absolute gem, such a genuinely kind, intelligent, and innovative human. I'm really, really grateful for his work, and I love that you're working with him. One of the things through studying Remy and through learning so much about neurology is just how, it seems so obvious to say that the brain is in charge of everything that we do. But I certainly didn't realize how dramatically impactful it is on, on your hormones, on your thyroid, on your immune system, obviously on your gut. And so to me, I'm always obsessed with how do we optimize brain health? Because that's really going to impact every other aspect of it. And even to the point, for a long time, I was such a gut nerd. I was like, oh, it's all about the gut, which of course we love studying the gut and optimizing it. It's super important. But again, as I see with Remy, he's got a perfect diet. I'm a proper psycho mom. That kid has been, on an ideal diet his entire life, and his gut is totally dysregulated. It's not because of what he's eating. It's because his brain cannot regulate his GI system. So I'd love to hear a little bit more how you got started with Dr. Malello and what you're learning about the two hemispheres and how that's impacting the immune system, because I think it's really, really interesting. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't understand the ramifications of in terms of long-term health beyond childhood developmental issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny. I found Dr. Malello's work at a time when my own brain health was very poor, so I don't remember the details. I know that I was stuck. So this was a few years ago, and my brain was inflamed. I had no short-term memory. I had no attention. I was kind of in PTSD land, and I was trying to fix myself. And I was trying to fix myself in the sense I knew enough to know that most practitioners didn't quite know what they were doing. So I wasn't going to just show up at a practitioner's office and ask for help. It needed to be the right person. So at some point in that, I found his work, and I don't recommend this to anyone, that if you have no short-term memory and no attention issues, I could hardly read, and my eyes weren't working very well, and I was trying to help myself by studying developmental neuroimmunology. That wasn't the kindest thing to try to do to myself, but I was desperate, And so I do remember a few things from starting that training. This was back in 2020. One was learning about the role of the hemispheres in the immune system, and that the left hemisphere amps up the immune system and increases it and increases inflammation, and the right hemisphere calms it down. And that was a very humbling moment for me in terms of recreating what I thought I understood, because I really considered myself to be an expert in immune conditions. and fairly so. I had overcome my own autoimmune conditions. I had done lots of extra training. I'd been treating them for a long time. I got decent results. So that was all fine. But how could I not have known something so basic? I mean, that's not a detail. That's not a small detail. If you don't know that, you don't understand what you're looking at, right? So when I say that with respect. If you're listening, I'm not criticizing you. I'm talking about myself 4 years ago, And so this is not a small problem. And everything is downstream of that. So same thing with hormones. Like you have endocrine experts and hormone experts who don't understand how the brain works, but it's all happening downstream of the brain. So one of the tests that is very common for functional medicine practitioners to run is a Dutch test. And that's a hormone test. Well, to me, that's a nervous system test and a mitochondrial test, but you won't see those words anywhere on the exam, and you won't hear the folks at Precision Analytical, I don't think, at least I've not come across it, discussing those things, and they're very smart, and I have respect for them, but this is not a small problem. If you don't understand where the basic pieces fit together, you don't understand what you're looking at, so then you're going to run a hormone test and start giving pregnenolone and DHEA and adaptogens and all this stuff, not understanding that the basic system that's upstream is wonky. So, so I stumbled across Dr. Malilla's work at a time when I needed it most, and then I ended up doing his most recent. I'm in the process of doing his most recent fellowship. I'm going to be back there this weekend. I also bring my daughter to see him. I'm also a patient of his, and I've benefited a lot under his care.
Yeah, I gotta love the adult diagnosis of, self-diagnosis of ADD. But then in hindsight, I look back and I'm like, okay, I played soccer very competitively my entire life. So heading the soccer ball all day, I snowboarder, definitely got a handful of concussions in there. So it's funny as you learn about it and you're just like, yeah.
Well, there's another relationship there, which is very interesting. We talked a little bit about hyper and hypo feelers. So folks who have ADHD, most of those patterns, because it's a pattern, right? Most patterns are associated with a relatively overdeveloped left hemisphere and a relatively underdeveloped right hemisphere, which makes sense if you understand how the brain works, because 4 of the 5 types of attention live in the right prefrontal cortex. And then there's another pattern that's more like a daydreaming, absent type ADD that's more of a right hemisphere dominance. Well, our sense of embodiment and feeling is in the right hemisphere. So there's actually a correlation between like kids who don't feel pain as well and don't feel fear as well, more likely to hit their heads. That was me. Like I had lots of head injuries, but they was related to the uneven development where I didn't have appropriate fear for things. And I was always smashing my head against things and not really caring. And so that's part of it too. And I see that with my patients, where you take the history and you're like, oh, this must be a concussion thing. But if you take it further, and one patient who's like, yeah, I fell out of a tree, and it's like, well, tell me about that. And it's like, yeah, because he was being an idiot up in a tree because he doesn't have an appropriately developed right hemisphere, or that he's outside in the cold all the time. And that's a common thing. I was always wearing shorts in the winter because I couldn't feel the cold. So that's related to the concussion history. So it becomes really interesting because you can start to see how these things fit together. For me, when my system crashed again as an adult, that's when I realized that I didn't have a diagnosis of ADHD as a kid, but I don't know how that's even possible. My teachers, fortunately, I was at a small school, and it's probably because I was a girl and not a boy. I wasn't destructive. They let me wander the halls. I mean, if I was sat, I was tapping nowadays you can bring your dogs to school. You can bring your fidget things to school. I mean, I didn't have any of that in the 1980s and 90s. So it's not like it's not like a kind of theoretical diagnosis. It's very clear that that's what I was experiencing, but it's also been exciting as an adult, really using accurate frameworks to correct the imbalances that were leading to that.
Yeah, I just think it's so amazing how many different things we can impact by supporting brain health, and how many ways we are absolutely demolishing brain health with the additional chemicals that we're eating and putting in our clothes, and, screen time, and, disconnect from other humans. one of the things that I've talked about a couple of times on the podcast, I want to introduce you also to the Family Hope Center, because you'll love them also. It's more developmental, and I know you work more with adults, but they have a fascinating program also that I think you'll enjoy. But so I've had Matt Newell on here talking about retained reflexes, and Melillo touched on it a little bit also. But again, I think it's really important for adults, because a lot of what I'm trying to advocate for on the podcast is like, as adults, as parents in particular, like, I can't take care of myself if I don't take care of myself. And that was a really hard learned lesson after burning myself out so hardcore studying this shit like crazy before Rennie was diagnosed in those first couple of years of his diagnosis. And now I'm like, okay, I've got to make sure that I'm doing really well. And I also have learned that I have some significant adverse patterning in my brains and trauma, like all these different things that we're unpacking. So I think that the retained reflexes are super interesting. I also think that there's so much of this that relates to adult illness that we're not really tapped into as a society. So I'd love for you to talk about retained reflexes and how they're impacting like the nervous system development and long-term health. We've touched on it a bit with the immune system, but
yeah, I love this question, because I'm definitely on a mission to raise awareness of this, because this is such low-hanging fruit. So primitive reflexes are these movement patterns that we are born with that allow us to do things when our brain is immature. So they mainly develop in utero before we're born, and then they kind of come out and get integrated in this really finely tuned timing of sequence. And it's related to milestones. So as you learn how to do new things and other things recede, so it's very beautiful. It's like the orchestra of your life unfolding. And they, for the most part, all of them should be integrated really by 6 months of age. There's maybe one that's about 12 months of age, but really by the time you're like kind of through your, midway through your first year, they should be gone. And they're still there, they're still in the brainstem, but the development of the higher levels of the brain is coming down and inhibiting them. And then they can be used as part of a repertoire for more sophisticated and advanced movements. So a lot of professional athletes like they're using these things, more skillfully, right? So maybe like a musician like learns the basics, and then they're going to play with the basics and do really cool stuff. So a few things. So one is that if we test someone who's older than a year old and those reflexes are still present, that's never normal. Like, that's just not a normal thing. And it's an objective thing. And so for most people, the brain might seem like a black box that we don't, they kind of know it's here somewhere, but they don't know enough about it to interface with it. But if we do these tests, we can really clearly see objective signs of brain immaturity, or the other possibility is brain damage or like neural degeneration. So here's my thing. This is a non-invasive test. It takes 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes to do, and if you get tested accurately and there's no findings, then congratulations, like go enjoy yourself. Like, but that's like 8 minutes of your life, However, for so many people, this is going to be the bottleneck for their health. And it's also going to explain so many things about their life, depending on their pattern. And also, best part is that we can do stuff. We can address these results, right? I don't test for things that you can't do anything about, So in this case, you can drive specific targeted stimulation to the areas that are underdeveloped to get them to develop, and then see how you're doing, then see where you're at. And this, it's not to say that this is going to be the solution to all of your problems. It's a first things first. It's a prerequisite. Finishing infant brain development, I'm talking to an adult here, right? Finishing your infant brain development is a prerequisite for everything else you're trying to do to improve your health and manage your life, And it was funny when I saw Dr. Melillo, and then I'm trying to implement the program, which, is involved. And I was often feeling very overwhelmed, and a lot of that is because of my neural circuitry, right? Trying to organize and prioritize when I can't feel my body very well. It's very hard to make decisions if you're not embodied. And I'd look at my to-do list and go, oh my gosh, I have to do this and that and that and that. And I'm like, well, surely the first things first is that before I respond to that email and pay that bill and get back to that patient, I need to complete my infantile neurological development. That's the first thing that needs to happen today, right? So that was kind of how I managed to get myself to prioritize it. But this is it. So this affects you cognitively, emotionally, definitely, attention, these higher abilities, including compassion, executive function, and then also health. So I work mainly with adults with complex chronic illness like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, autoimmunity, chronic infections, all of these things. And, they're in the literature, there's a strong relationship between adverse childhood events and health problems as an adult. But now through the lens of developmental neurology, we can be way more specific about what the details are behind that relationship.
I love that you're going down this rabbit hole so deeply, because it really is so important for people to understand. One thing I think we just want to make sure that everybody understands that the brain does develop from the bottom up. So as you're saying, if we don't deal with these primitive reflexes, those are in the brainstem typically, and then the brain cannot process and grow and develop fully unless you actually get that foundational level done. And this is something I've seen with so many kids. Obviously, I work more with kids and have a lot of friends with children with special needs, and something I've seen with Remy. And I also like telling the story of my dad had a major heart surgery a couple of years ago. And then guess what? His startle reflex came right back. And I was like, can we integrate that? And he just looked at me like I was crazy. So, it is what it is. But I do think brain health is the foundation of all of it. I also think it's, Remy had no reflexes pretty much. And we had a 72, he was induced 72-hour labor ending with a C-section because he was not moving down the birth canal. And so, it's always that hindsight. As you learn it, it's pretty fascinating to dive into. So as, let's see, where do I want to go from here? One thing I'm curious about, I just wrote down a note. As you're nerding out on all the neuro patterns that you're seeing, and this might be too nerdy for most of our listeners, but I'm curious how you're seeing that overlay with the Chinese medical diagnoses that you're seeing, different types of ADD, as you're discussing, sound very much like spleen qi deficiency. Are you playing with that overlap a lot? Is that something that you're exploring a little bit, or? I wanted to take a moment and talk to you about Radical Roots. So I founded this company when my son Remy was diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder and intractable epilepsy. As a doctor of Chinese medicine, I knew that the best way to support his complex neurological and physiological needs would be through dynamic Chinese herbal formulas. I also started studying the incredible effects of hemp and its ability to support and regulate the brain and the body. By combining targeted Chinese herbal formulas with complete spectrum hemp and using a unique alchemical spagyric extraction technique, we have created formulas that are true game changers. Honestly, I truly believe that these are some of the most powerful herbal formulas on the market. Please check out radicalrootsherbs.com, use the code RADREMEDY, and get 15% off your first order. I'm so proud of these, and I think you guys are going to love them as much as I do.
Yes, it is something I'm exploring. Because I'm studying the roots of the Neijing with Dr. Ed Neal, it's really much, again, rewritten my understanding of Chinese medicine. And in many ways, it's different, a little bit different than TCM, which was my original training. And, and it's based on translating the original text. So in my original education, which was, I look back on very fondly, it was a very nice experience, but I never read any part of the classics, and all of Chinese medicine is based on the Neijing. So I didn't know what was in there. I didn't, and this is a wider problem in our profession, especially if you go to any online forum, someone asks a question, you can get any kind of answer, but there's no real requirement for any proper justification for the answer. It can just really be my teacher said so, or based on this lineage. And so you get just all sorts of conflicting things. And then there's this idea well, the more perspectives, the merrier. And yeah, I think if we can bring a little more rigor and a little more deeper understanding to it, it can be helpful. So for me, the understanding that I have of the patterns of the universe and how nature works is the big map of my understanding. It's like the major metaphysics or schema that I place everything on. So if I'm learning developmental neurology, then I'm thinking about that in terms of Neijing medicine and Neijing science. And actually, just as a little bit of a segue, a lot of practitioners want to understand how to explain Chinese medicine in terms of biochemistry and reductionist science. And I think that there's an argument for that in terms of communication. If you're speaking as like a language, you want to explain to a patient what you're doing with liver 3 in terms of serotonin, like knock yourself out. But the appropriate relationship is actually to explain how biochemistry and reductionist physiology fits into Neijing medicine, because that's the larger map. And that has an understanding of the universe that's based on both like non-physical and physical phenomenon, which is much more aligned with physics and how physics understands things. And actually, if you study physics, you see how many decades behind medicine is, really, in terms of what humans know about how things work and then what is being practiced on people. It's very, very breathtaking. So when I look at developmental neurology, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into in terms of my understanding of like how it applies to my understanding from the Neijing, but I'm placing it into that map of how do living things develop and how do they form and what's the patterns that all living things follow. And then we can see where the developmental neurology fits within that. And now, because I've been teaching this a little bit with the Neijing folks at the Apricot Grove, that's now part of the exam where it's like a first things first. But before you treat a patient, it's called preparing the ground, right? Like, what's the first things first? What are the things that might be present here that might block our treatment from working? So, for example, someone has like tennis elbow, we can treat, but if their spine's out of whack, that's going to block the treatment from working because that's more upstream. Or if someone has like a big old scar, then that might block our treatment from working. But now we're looking at the neurological development and saying, well, look, that's the first things first. That's like the earlier in the development. So that's how I'm thinking about combining them, which is how I approach any new area.
Interesting. And I've heard you talk about interplaying the Neijing and some learnings with HRV. I'm curious to learn more about that because I haven't gotten to listen to your lecture on it. But if you could give our listeners a little, I haven't talked about HRV or polyvagal theory on the podcast yet. And those are both things that I enjoy nerding out on, and I'd love your perspective on them. So I'd be curious if you could give like an overview of what HRV is and sort of how you're seeing that interweave with your studies.
So heart rate variability. So when our heart beats, we think of our heart rate in terms of beats per minute, but there's actually a little bit of variation. So let's say we have our heart's beating at 60 beats per minute. It's not going to be like a metronome. It's going to be a little bit, sometimes it's going to be a little bit faster than that, and sometimes it's going to be a little slower than that. And what we understand is that actually having that variation is a sign of health and nervous system resilience. And it's actually down to a specific aspect of it, which is that when you inhale, your heart rate should go up. And when you exhale, your heart rate should go down. And when this is happening, there's good coherence in your nervous system, like the respiratory centers of your nervous system between breathing and heartbeat. And that's a sign of all the good things. And when it's lower and more metronome-like, that's more associated with like a sympathetic stress physiology. So more and more people are measuring their heart rate variability, either intentionally because they've heard about it on the podcast and they want to go measure it, or they have like an Apple Watch or a Whoop or an Oura Ring or whatever it is, and it's telling them their heart rate variability. And now they're like, well, what's that? Like, was my number good? What was this about? And for me, back when my system was not functioning well at all, and I was very detached from all that. So I'm like, oh, I'm fine. My heart rate variability was like very, very low. And so I was like, oh, that's not a good sign. So I got very interested in learning about it. But what I discovered fairly quickly is that all of the resources available online that were describing how this works were missing important context, which is to the kind of the theme here. It's like people don't understand the first principles. So they're saying things that are partially true, which means that they're sometimes not true. And so in this case, the reason why this ties to polyvagal theory is that we have a nerve called the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body. It's getting increasing attention and love because it attaches our brain to all of our internal organs, except for the spleen. And so it has this two-way connection, but especially going from the organs up to the brain is how we know how we're doing, essentially. And so when that integration's good, then we're healthier and then we feel well. And this explains partly why if we get stressed, we might get IBS and things like this. But there is a researcher, doctor named Stephen Porges, and in the 1960s, he was researching heart rate variability, and he was in a neonatal intensive care unit. And at that time, they were monitoring heart rate variability on the infants, as partly to make sure, to kind of see early warning signs of things going in a potentially dangerous direction. And what he noticed was that heart rate variability, as it dropped, it might drop, showing a problem, but at a certain point, the heart rate, how fast the heart was beating, might drop dangerously low, and the heart rate variability was going up, which is the opposite of what you would expect. And so he was saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Heart rate variability is associated with health, and yet in these sick newborns, when their heart rate is getting dangerously low, their heart rate variability is going up. What's that about? And he called this the vagal paradox. And the way he figured out what was going on is that the vagus nerve has two beginning points in the brain stem, and then they come together into the nerve, and then they come to the body. So there's an older, like an evolutionarily older one, and it's developmentally older as well, and an evolutionarily newer one. And so having higher heart rate variability is associated with being like calm and connected and happy and like all of the positive things of being relaxed and present and slowing down. But we can also slow down as an emergency response to life threat. So there's like a bit of a curve here. We're relaxed, and then there's like danger. Now our heart rate might go up, and then we might decide if we're going to run away or fight or like freeze or whatever. But if we're like really screwed, and then, where it's like things are really, really dire, as a last ditch effort, everything might slow way down. The brake goes way down. And that's the more ancient vagus nerve that's doing a survival response. And that was associated with higher heart rate variability. So what I was discovering in myself and my patients was that this explanation that you will read everywhere on the internet about like higher is better for heart rate variability and lower is worse, and when you're more relaxed this happens, is missing important context, because for a lot of my patients, when they get stressed, their heart rate variability goes up because they're going into a shutdown. So that's not applying to everyone, but it's applying to enough people that we just want to understand what we're looking at, and so that's that connection there. But we can also connect this to how this is a big part of how we connect to our environment and to the greater world and to the universe, and then connect down to our cells. So our heart is integrating signals and rhythms from like what time of year it is and where we are geographically, and seasonal rhythms and time of day and all of those things, and then it's kind of bringing it in and then orchestrating what's going on in our physiology, a lot of that through the vagus nerve. If we get sick or stressed or threatened, then at the cellular level, we have an evolutionarily conserved response that all cells go through a 3-step process in order to address a threat, repair damage, and reintegrate with the network. And this is called the cell danger response, which is a term coined by Bob Navio. I call it the cell healing cycle. And so basically as part of that, so this is cells that are like part of you and part of me and like part of this network. In order to heal, they actually become autonomous. Or he says like they have cellular autism. They become separate. And they have to become separate in order to run this program to heal. So when we get sick, our vagus nerve intentionally reduces tone. It becomes less active. We become less integrated so that we can run these less, like if you have a fever, you're not going to be it's going to be hard for you to do your taxes, right? These like higher cognitive functions go offline, and you're just like, I'm going to lie down because that's all I can do. That's all I'm good for, right? So you become more primitive. You become more simple, right? And your vagal tone goes down. And so this is why the literature shows that higher healthy heart rate variability is associated with better outcomes in every area, and that lower heart rate variability is associated with ill health. And part of that is because when we are sick, we intentionally reduce our vagal tone in order to heal. And if that gets stuck and it doesn't complete, then we're chronically ill. But it doesn't necessarily follow that just stimulating the vagus nerve is how to get better, because if you have an infection, then you need inflammation in order to get better.
One of the things that I've seen you say is that you would rather have 12 good Chinese herbal formulas than a whole stack of supplements. Why? Why would that be?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. This is, again, part of my, my like deeply humbling, experience where, as I said, I got my master's degree in functional medicine. I did a lot of additional training. And even in those additional trainings, I was constantly going down PubMed and doing additional courses to really understand the biochemistry. And honestly, as well, like my teachers were all excellent teachers, were a little bit too easy to stump with my questions. And I wasn't asking them to stump them or to be a smartass. It was like, because I was trying to solve problems. And it was clear that they didn't understand the essence of it, but that's not their fault. It's because you can't understand the essence of it because it's not at the first principles level. It's ununderstandable, really, at that level. And when I kind of had this very humbling it wasn't a moment. It was like over a year where I was like, I don't know anything. Like I just need to start over, which is hard, but totally worth it. And I started using certain formulas based on a very pragmatic approach to herbs. So I didn't go back and get a degree in herbs. I studied herbs from a number of people who had studied with a doctor in China named Jin Zhao, who has a very a kind of very prolific practice. He treats like 150 to 200 patients a day, and he basically had found ways that Chinese herbs have been practiced at a time in history that was similar to this time, where the diet was similar and the lifestyle was similar and the patterns were similar. And he used very clean algorithmic thinking to figure out very quickly how to use certain formulas that were very high leverage to both help a lot of people and also how to very accurately interpret feedback so that if you use it a certain way and then based on what happens, you know what the next move is. So this is someone who's, he's something like 7th generation doctor. He's seeing all these people. He's getting excellent results. He has like a line snaking out of his practice. But it's really a different way of thinking about it. That rather you have your typical complex chronic patient who has like all of the things going on. They've got digestive issues and mood issues and rashes and like leaky gut and all these like diagnoses. They have all these things going on. And really, whether you're a Chinese medicine herbalist or a functional medicine practitioner, like where are you going to start with them? And the answer to that's like I'm telling you, I'm always open for debate, but like it's kind of arbitrary. So if you're a functional medicine practitioner, it's going to be based usually on your most recent seminar. So you might start with the gut or the thyroid or the brain or the hormones or the mold or whatever it is. But if you get a group of functional medicine practitioners around a table, they're all going to start somewhere different. And it's going to be based on the new and shiny. I'm calling it like I see it because this was me a few years ago.
1,000%. No, I've been guilty and I see it all, please. Yeah.
I've been very, very guilty. Okay. So this is where I'm coming from. If you are a Chinese medicine practitioner, and again, listen, people are doing excellent work and they're continually, doing new training. So I don't want to paint people in a certain brush, but at least the way people are trained is really to try to find the pattern or try to find the patterns and then match the formula or formulas or whatever you're doing to the person you see in front of you. And that seems like it should be a good thing to do, but it's hard because what you're getting is such a mix of different times and different mechanisms and different layers, and it's all presenting it to you at the same time. And if you're putting something together based on that, again, it can be hard to really know how to iterate. You can maybe, all right, well, let's dial down this herb and dial up this herb. I mean, you can try it, but it's still tricky. And that's a little bit what I fell foul of when I went to see the herbalist back when I had dysentery before I even trained. Really well trained, really excellent woman, really like her. I remember what formula she used on me, and now I understand that it was really, unfortunately, I understand why it was the wrong formula, even though she wasn't being a dummy by recommending it. And so, in this way of treating, where you're using very clean, systematic thinking to take people through a process, you're really working with the reality of the complexity of all the different things that people have going on, and you're approaching it in an order that makes sense. And it's still individualized, but the process isn't. Just like if you were going to renovate a house, like your general contractor should really go through a process that's kind of the same for all houses. And through going through that process, they're going to find what you need to do with your house, if that makes sense, So like, do we need to fix the roof? If it's like the roof is like falling apart, then yes, let's start with fixing the roof. Oh, no, your roof is intact. Great. We're not going to fix the roof. We're going to go on to the next thing. It's a bit like that. So that's how I'm working with it now.
That's super interesting. That is one of the things that's always fascinating to me as a practitioner. It is the question of like, where do we start when people have these very layered health issues that are going on? And one of the things that I've been very adamant about recently is like, I'm very frustrated with the clear failure of the Western medical system. Again, like I always like to point out that like Western doctors, I have no doubt are in there for the right reasons, but the system is clearly failing us. It's the third leading cause of death in America. So like, we can't really argue that it's doing so very well.
Well, let me ask you a question to reframe it. So any system is optimized for a certain output. So what is the output that the medical system is optimized for?
Keeping people sick.
Right. To what end, then? No, to what end?
Yeah. To make money.
Right. So is it failing?
Not for them, but for us.
No, the system is working perfectly. The system is working perfectly for the outcomes that it is optimized for. Anyways.
I always get a kick out of people who will be like, well, you're just trying to make money off of your herb company. And I'm like, I'm trying to pay my rent. Like, I'm not like I give herbs away. I do a tremendous amount of free stuff. But so to me, like one of my big problems with Chinese medicine, alternative medicine, functional medicine, it's so we have this Western medical system that clearly is not serving anybody who's trying to get healthy. And, obviously, again, I don't blame the doctors. I blame their training, which is paid by pharma and like all of the systems that they're within. I would not want to be in that system. I'm so grateful that I get to treat patients the way I want to treat patients and spend the time with them that I think is necessary. But the alternative medical system and the wellness industry is really just focused at like the 1% who can afford it and have the time to be able to go, like if you're getting acupuncture, you need to get acupuncture fairly regularly. It's expensive. It takes time. It's not even something that I, as a doctor of Chinese medicine, actually fucking do regularly. So like, it's not really nobody's really speaking to like the 98% of our society. So that's one of the things that I've been trying to figure out is like, how can we, beyond the basics of like, okay, we've got to clean up your diet. You got to get out and walk, which 90% of people do need to just focus on the fucking basics, like get some sleep, get some fresh air, get some movement, eat actual real food, reduce toxins, sweat a little, like those are all like the basics. But like, how can we help take the the majority of our population and help start giving them the roadmap to building health without, charging them a tremendous amount of money, and how, can that be systematized? So I think it's interesting that that's sort of part of what you're doing. I'm not saying that we should do it without practitioners, but just trying to, in my head, I'm just trying to find a way that we can make these things more accessible to more people.
These are really good questions. I think, first is that we want to, always going back to first principles, making sure that we've understood problems accurately and correctly. Because if you're trying to solve the wrong thing, then you're kind of dead in the water. I think there's a number of ways I think about it. One is that when we talk about anything that's very new, like Dr. Malillo's approach to developmental neurology, when you're at the bleeding edge, things it's usually before they scale. So I see that as just a normal part of any development curve. So there can sometimes be oh, well, it's great if you could afford it. Yeah, no, listen, we need to get there. That's an important thing that everyone needs to be able to access it. But before everyone can access a thing, it needs to be developed first. It's the same thing with technology. It's the same thing with the car. I don't even see that really as an evil. It really is just how it's a natural pattern. Once there's enough people interested in it and doing it, the costs go down and the availability comes up. So, and then if you aren't an early adopter, then you're not guinea pigged. So there's an advantage. But so one thing I'd like to see, for example, everyone having a primitive reflex exam. That's something that I want to increase awareness, but it also is it can be accessible in the sense that it's non-invasive. It doesn't require a blood test. I've taught this to people on other sides of the world and had their non-medical partners do this. So it's something that can be done and hopefully can be scaled. And so we're seeing, as we're understanding more that this is an important thing to do, we're seeing that scaled a little bit more. I think with something like acupuncture, this is my own perspective on this, is that from a health economics perspective, in order for acupuncture to make sense on paper, it needs to be done in a community setting. I'm saying this to someone who does not have a community clinic, so I'm not saying this is Mel thinks this. It's I have a one-to-one clinic, but I'm just saying that if you want it to make sense from an economics standpoint, then it needs to be done in a multi-bed setting. There's a really great clinic that's about an hour and a half from me here. It is in a very working class area. It's a very busy clinic. It is very affordable. These are not these are not fancy people, but they can afford to go 3 times a week if they need to. And they're going because it helps them. So in order to so we need to understand the model that it's never going to be accessible for most people to do a one. But acupuncture was never, it wasn't designed, that wasn't the context in which it developed. It was a one-to-many model. And that was one of the ways that it worked. So teasing those things out. And then, I don't know, I think it's tricky. These are the harder questions, because it's not just the healthcare system. Is if the environment itself is unhealthy, then it's you in order to try to be healthy in an unhealthy environment, you by definition are expending an incredible increase in energy. And I think it's kind of unrealistic to expect most people to do that, especially if they're not in a particularly advantaged situation. So then it really becomes about trying to make the environment healthier, and those are stickier questions again, and by healthier, I mean environmental pollution and all of those things, but even in the United States, where we don't have a statutory maternal leave, where it's, by law, puppies are required to stay with their dog, with their moms longer than American babies. And the effect that has on development, and the effect that has on societal costs, but there's a million examples like that. So for me, excuse me, I'm more, if I'm working at that level, I'm more interested in helping to change those things than to figure out how everyone can get one-to-one acupuncture or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Yeah, I think for me, it's just this constant questioning of like, how can I be of service and make these things more accessible and help people feel empowered to start taking control of their health. Like, I love nerding out on all of this, but for whatever bizarre twist of my path, like, this is like advocacy for health and like trying to spread awareness and like trying to learn more and share what I'm learning and the brilliant people that I'm fortunate enough to like connect with and get to learn from with other people is something that I play with a lot. And I just, it's devastating watching the demise of the health of our society and particularly the health of our children. I mean, it's just so hard to, and clearly I'm not like, I know that the answers are so complex, but it's one of those things that I'm just constantly trying to look at because I'm like, the demise of our children's health, like 54% of children now have a chronic health disorder. And that was from a statistic from a research study like 5 years ago. So I'm sure it's higher than that. The neurodevelopmental disorders are skyrocketing. I'm of the belief that, these rare genetic disorders like Remy has are elevating dramatically also, but the research won't show that until there's enough of the genetic diseases being diagnosed, because like Remy's disorder wasn't even a disorder that was known about 10 years ago. So like, how can we compare that data to previous? I just, I live in the weird world of biohacking and trying to do these things sometimes. And it's hard for me to understand the fixation on longevity and anti-aging when I'm like, we're looking at the demolition of our society in our children. And like, we've got to start finding a better path forward. And I think that like all the synthesis that you're doing is a beautiful perspective on all of it. And I think it really brings it together in a wonderful way.
That's a cool, an important application of it. I mean, definitely Dr. Neal talks about how if you really want to change things, you don't focus on the details. You need to change the entire story. So a lot of his work is really about creating a healthier story. And that story needs to be based on nature and how nature works. And I think that there will be something in that's key that both helps our children and helps make solutions more accessible and also helps, like, for me, I think a big problem is like just the massive levels of confusion that people have about the most basic things. And there's been, I would say, a deliberate assault on common sense and on just having a perspective that everything, if you don't have 7 PhDs, then you're not allowed to have an opinion. So you just need to like listen to whoever. And then also very well-intentioned people, especially people who like come into my world who have, attended all of the health summits and like listened to all the podcasts, and they're no less confused. They just have like more specifics to go with it. And so going back to nature, which may sound fluffy or fairy or woo, that's Dr. Neal would say, go back to nature. That's sort of what I mean by first principles, is understanding how reality works at its core. And really that might sound highfalutin, but we're just talking about the basic things, like the sun rises in the east and then it goes up and then it sets in the west. And there will probably be like some asshole who wants to disagree with that. But I think for the most part, if we can reclaim those basic truths that do not change over time, that you can see with your own eyes and with your feet on the ground and start there as a starting point, then we can then move forward in a healthier direction.
I love that. And I think it's so accurate. And it is one of those things where even I like get caught in the weeds of like, okay, like how do we optimize each of these things? And it is one of those things where it's like, you always have to try and bring it back to being centered and grounded and like tapped in to nature and what's going on. So you fully convinced me to take Dr. Ed's class. And again, well, I'm going to ask you one more question, actually, just for my curiosity, and then I'll let you go. But I'm just curious what you're nerding out on right now. Like, what's sort of catching your attention the most right now? Because it seems like you have the type of mind that's really fascinating. Like, curious.
Oh gosh, I love it when people ask me that question. So right now, and that's in the last few days, I'm focused on the vestibular system. So in the last module that I studied with Dr. Malillo, they have a guy who is an expert in the vestibular system from Australia, Dr. Carlo Renato, who flies over from Australia for a couple of days and flies back. And really, he's kind of, he studies the development of the nervous system from the perspective of the vestibular system. And I'm realizing that I've integrated my reflexes now and that I have vestibular issues. And I also can see that my patients have vestibular issues. I'm seeing different clues. And again, these are a lot of things that I'm discovering. But again, it's based on these first principles where I'm kind of have a good sense that I'm onto something. So for example, I mentioned before that my heart rate variability was extremely low. Now, no matter what I've done, it's been hard to get it up, but the truth is that it's actually higher in the day now. So when I track it or wear it, it's actually kind of nice and I'm feeling a lot better, but when I'm asleep, it's still low. But I'm realizing for a variety of reasons that I have like an underactive vestibular system so that when I don't have gravity as an input, it's affecting how my nervous system's functioning.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So that's my hypothesis, which I will test by getting a proper vestibular assessment and then integrating it and see if anything changes. So again, we're trying it out. But I know that I have eye focus issues and things like that. So that's been very interesting because I also there's a lot of things from it. So one is that the labyrinth of the ear and the vestibule of the ear are the first parts of the nervous system to develop in utero, but they actually reach adult size development in utero. There's no other part of the body that does that.
That's wild.
So it's like we are developing and growing out of our sense of where we are on Earth, right? And this is detecting gravity. This ties in things like non-native EMFs because it's interfering with the signals that allow us to know where we are. And then the Earth itself, its magnetic strength is reducing over the last couple of years. So there's like all of these different things. But anyways, that's what I'm nerding out about at the moment.
Oh my God, that's so much fun. Yeah, I did a deep dive on vestibular integration back when Rem was younger because he was like a swing addict. Like he, it's again, very hyposensitive. And then Malillo had us spinning him and then his eyes would do the bounce back. So yeah. Oh, this is so much fun. Okay. Well, I'm going to call it for today, but truly, I am so grateful for the work that you're doing. I'm really grateful for your time and wisdom. I love your humility and brilliance. They're a beautiful juxtaposition, and it's really fun to get to pick your brain. So I would definitely love to have you back in the future. And if ever there's anything at all I can do to support your work, just say the word.
I really appreciate it. It's been really fun chatting with you.
Thank you for listening to the Radical Remedy Podcast. The Radical Remedy Podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing or other professional health care services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor/patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.